Despite the COVID-19 pandemic last year, African entrepreneurs continue to innovate and attract record levels of venture capital investments. Now, a new report by the African Private Equity and Venture Capital Association revealed that the volumes of total reported venture capital deals in Africa in 2020 rose to 319 from just 140 the year before. Now, startups were the stars, raising over $1 billion. AVCA says they're changing the continent's economic landscape and also creating new market opportunities. Now, also, financials remain the most attractive sector for VC investment, followed closely by information technology. But most importantly, technology is clearly driving that growth. 90% of all reported VC deals between 2014 and 2020 were in technology-enabled firms who are operating across a variety of sectors. Well, let's now delve further into that report. We're joined by Abi Mustafa Madwakor. She is the CEO of African Private Equity and Venture Capital Association. Great to have you with us today. Now, it certainly appears that the pandemic and a challenging year for private investment globally, that has had no visible negative impact on VC activity in Africa. In fact, we're seeing the volumes of deals increasing. Give us a sense, what were some of the key findings in that report? What has it revealed about the importance of startups to Africa's growth story going forward?
Great. Firstly, hello, Jay. Thank you for having me. Yes, indeed, the past 2 years have been quite successful for VC in Africa, particularly in 2020, as you've mentioned. In terms of the volume of deals, there were 319 deals, which is 3 times the typical year-on-year average we've had over the past 6 years, really demonstrating the buoyancy and the increased interest in the sector. You also touched on the actual value of capital that was deployed to VC deals in 2020 being 1.1 billion. And this was just marginally lower than what was deployed in 2019. And the reason for this, as you can see, the volume of deals have increased, but the value has slightly decreased. And that's because we're seeing more activity in the seed stage investment, so the early stage investment, which was more than we had seen in previous years. So these deals, looking across the last 6 years, account for 30% of the deals that we've had in the 6-year period. If we look a little bit, just to focus on more headlines on where the regions where we're seeing this capital directed, South Africa is attracting the lion's share of VC deals, followed by Egypt, Nigeria, and Kenya. And it's worth noting how Egypt is increasingly becoming an investment destination for VC activity. And this is echoed by, we did an industry survey that we do annually, where we just survey the sentiment of a selection of limited partners and general partners. And they also ranked Egypt as a destination of interest for their investment over the next 3 years. So we are watching that space, and it's very exciting to see kind of VC activity just blossoming in that region. And I guess the final headline that I would like to highlight is really the diversity of where we're seeing deal activity. And I touch on this a lot, and I think it's quite important. We saw 11% of the VC investments that were invested in startups with a female CEO. Likewise, 31% of the investments went to startups that were founded by a female or had at least one female founder. Yes, it might not, it might be a dip in the ocean, but it's certainly a step in the right direction, and it certainly moves us closer to achieving gender parity in this space. But to answer your question about kind of what's the importance of startup in Africa in general, it can't be overstated, the importance of this community in Africa. We're an extremely enterprising continent, and startups have really, especially around COVID, started to innovate in critical spheres of the economy and just creating new ways and innovative ways to really address some of the long-standing challenges that we've had. And the beauty of this community is that they have the ability to scale thereby creating jobs and bridging the unemployment gap that has plagued the continent for quite some time. And we've seen that ability to scale in the likes of Flutterwave, Chipper Cash, and those other businesses that have raised later stage funding. And my final point around startups is what is really interesting, what we're starting to see is that startups themselves that have raised VC funding are starting to pay the cycle forward. So we recently saw Flutterwave invest in a Nigerian fintech earlier this year, and we also saw MFS Africa, a VC-backed company, invest in a Ugandan fintech startup this year. So it's an interesting movement. We're seeing entrepreneurs financing entrepreneurs, which is changing the economic landscape by really growing the available of domestic pool of capital that's available to invest in startups.
Right. And speaking of fintechs, 90% of all reported VC deals between 2014 and 2020, they were in tech-enabled companies across a variety of sectors, not just fintech. Looking at your findings, explain to us how we're seeing innovation and technology sort of driving economic growth and those VC deals right now.
Yes, so Uche, innovation has been critical over the last 18 months for reasons that are quite obvious. I mean, globally, we've gone through periods of restricted mobility. Some African countries are still going through that. We've had disruptions in global supply chains and simply globally, and the continent is no exception, we've really had to rethink how we do business and how we solve challenges. And technology has played a really critical role in just reframing our thinking on the continent and allowing entrepreneurs, as I said earlier, to create solutions that have disrupted traditional sectors. And unsurprisingly, as we all know, the adoption of technology in the financial sector has been the most prevalent, which is why fintech deals, financials account for the largest share of our tech and technology-enabled deals. And we've seen a lot of those raises, and I mentioned two of them earlier. But more broadly, the adoption of tech-enabled solution has been transformative across a variety of sectors, essentially bringing efficiency, reducing fragmentation in these sectors. And I'll just touch on a couple of these sectors. We've seen technology being used to address Africa's wide infrastructure deficit. As we all know, the public sector can't close that gap on its own, and the private sector is critical here. So we've seen a number of technological solutions being applied to close this gap with some interesting companies, doing some interesting things in digital solutions to access to electricity. Looking at the healthcare sector, as we saw, COVID-19 really exposed the fragility of Africa's health systems. And we've seen a number of businesses that operate across the wide gamut of the value chain in the healthcare space use technology as a key enabler to address some of the challenges. Businesses such as Ilara Health, which is a health tech powered diagnostic provider in Kenya. And if we look at the agriculture sector, technology is just changing the dynamics of this sector completely through the use of modernized farming technology, temperature, moisture sensors, drone, artificial intelligence, all of which to enhance farming productivity. And there we're seeing startups like Farm Crowdy in Nigeria and Kenya's M-Farm. And these startups, as well as some others, are really demonstrating the power of digitization in the agriculture sector. And I think that's really interesting, particularly because that sector has, historically done things in a bit of an archaic way. So it's really good to see the adoption of technology in that sector. And finally, in the transportation, logistics, and generally in the mobility sector, we're seeing a lot of innovation being applied there in companies like Heat Riding app, on the logistics side with Kobo 360, and also with Trello, the digital trucking marketplace in Egypt. So I definitely think it's trending positive. What's really good is that technology is almost becoming an enabler for a multitude of sectors. And I really think that trend is going to continue in 2021 and beyond.
Well, definitely a lot of encouraging trends there. But on that note, what are your findings in terms of who is investing and how much they're investing? And certainly, what does this all bode for Africa's private equity landscape this year and going forward?
So the good thing we're seeing is the wide breadth and diversity of investors in VC deals in 2020. And that's a similar theme to what we saw in 2019 as well. And when I talk about the diversity, I mean in the type of investor and the geography of the investors. So if we look at just the type of investors initially, we're seeing 40% of the investment in VC deals were by private equity and venture capital fund managers. So what's interesting is we've seen a lot of private equity fund managers investing in VC deals. So we saw the investment in Tunes, for instance, we saw by Helios, and we saw TPG Growth investment in Grow Intelligence. So that's interesting. And those fund managers coupled with VC fund managers account for about 40% of the VC deals. Then we move on to another interesting kind of cohort of investors, the corporate ventures, who account for about 10% of the VC deals that we saw in 2020. And these are the likes of, we're seeing Visa, Stripe, Google, Toyota Ventures. And our prediction is that we're going to see more of these corporate ventures coming to invest in Africa. And then we have other investors such as the accelerators, the incubators, family offices, angels, HNIs and foundations. And again, we're probably going to see more of these investors occupying spaces in VC deals. So if we look at where the capital is flowing from, almost 80% of the capital that went into the VC deals during the period were from international investors. Of that, 40% of them were North American investors, and that's not surprising given Silicon Valley players being excited about Africa and wanting to play in this space. What we're hoping to see is more domestic capital going into African VC. And like I touched on earlier, the fact that we're seeing entrepreneurs investing in entrepreneurs is really positive, and we're hoping to see the split between African vis-a-vis international investors, that ratio increase a little bit. And then in terms of kind of the value of these deals, what's interesting is that this year, less than 20% of the deals, of the investments were in deals 50 million and below, which is in contrast with last year, where about 50% of the deals were in 50 million and above. So what this is telling us is there's more activity, as I mentioned earlier, in this seed and early stage investing phase. And from what we've seen in 2021, this trend is likely to continue.
Well, we do have to leave it there, but many thanks for those great insights and that update on the report. That, of course, was Abi Mustafa Madrakor. She was the CEO of African Private Equity and Venture Capital Association.